but I've seen across the whole continent that multiculturalism has reaped what it has sowed. The killer of Theo van Gogh was born and bred in Amsterdam. London's 7/7 terrorists were, as the media put it, British lads. Is it any surprise that the children and grandchildren of immigrants, young people raised in a society suffused with a multicultural disdain for its own liberties, tell pollsters in staggeringly high numbers that they would like to see Sharia law in Europe? After all, the people whose lessons about the world they've taken in over the years in mosques and religious schools and Islamic community centers, the people whom they've read on Islamist websites and watched on Al Jazeera and other satellite channels, know what they believe in and stand for. The Al-Qaradawis of this world are not relativists. They aren't multiculturalists. They have a goal and a vision and a determination and a sense of identity and values that Western multiculturalists don't. And they know it. And therein lies their strength. Since 9/11, there have been a number of moments of truth. But in my view, the episode of the Danish cartoons was perhaps the critical moment for the struggle of freedom in the West against Islam and its multicultural appeasers and enablers. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with at least the general outlines of the story. After an editor at the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten learned that the illustrators in his country were scared to draw pictures of Muhammad for an innocuous children's book, he solicited and published drawings of Muhammad by a dozen different cartoonists. Thanks to a concerted international effort by Danish Muslim leaders who were determined to pressure the Danish government into apology and appeasement, their cartoons gained the attention of the world. And in a vivid demonstration of the fact that the appeasement of Islam is not an exclusively left or right-wing phenomenon, the cartoons were condemned by both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, by the Washington Post and the New York Times on the left and the Wall Street Journal on the right, by The Nation and the National Review, by Fox News and CNN. Very few places, very few publications even reprinted their cartoons, which they might have done out of solidarity with their colleagues at Jyllands-Posten, or simply to show the general public what all the fuss was about. In fact, only one major newspaper in the United States, the Philadelphia Inquirer, ran the cartoons, while here in Canada they were published, as far as I know, only in the Jewish Free Press and the Western Standard, both of which were reported to the Alberta Human Rights Commission for doing so. In Europe, to their credit, a few major newspapers reprinted their cartoons, though in all of Britain, not a single newspaper did so. And in Norway, the editor of a tiny Christian newspaper reprinted them, but after a couple of weeks of extreme pressure by people at the very highest levels of the Norwegian government, he caved in and, under the auspices of the Norwegian government, apologized to a roomful of imams for having exercised what he had mistakenly thought was his inalienable right to publish what he wished. In the wake of their shameful and craven response to the Danish cartoons, the Western media and Western leaders have only grown increasingly willing to trim fundamental freedoms to placate jihadists. Again, this is not and should not be seen as a matter of left and right. If many on the left view the criticism of Islam as a violation of the multicultural precept that we in the West have no right to say anything negative about another culture, many people on the Christian right are loath to insult fellow people of faith and thereby invite unwelcome scrutiny of their own religion. And for many people on both sides of the political spectrum, this is, of course, quite simply a matter of fear. And there's yet another factor. Some of you may have followed the recent controversy surrounding a forthcoming book from Yale University Press about the Danish cartoons, a book in which it was announced that the cartoons themselves, absurdly, would not appear. The head of Yale University Press said he feared retribution. Others have pointed to evidence strongly suggesting that the decision not to include the cartoons in the book came from the very highest levels of the university itself and had something to do with the Yale administration's concern about offending Saudi Arabian princes with deep pockets. The powerful impact of Saudi money in the West has already made itself clear. Countless mosques and madrasas in Europe would not exist if not for Saudi money. The Washington Post's resident authority on Islam, John Esposito, is the director of an institute on Islam at Georgetown University that was funded entirely by the Saudi prince for whom it is named, and who himself handpicked Esposito to run it. It is one of the most despicable and grotesque aspects of the present conflict that even as George W. Bush sent soldiers to put their lives on the line to fight armed jihad, he continued to be extremely friendly with Saudi leaders who fund schools and mosques and institutions in the West that teach and preach jihad and that give it both moral and material support. So far, those who have taken an open stand against the Islamization of the West have been people more or less identified with the right. For doing so, they've been criticized intensely by many on the left. This is madness, and it only shows how far many people on the left have migrated philosophically from being true liberals. They don't seem to know what liberal values are anymore, and they don't recognize an absurdly obvious threat to liberal values when it's staring them right in the face. To put it simply, this is and should be a liberal battle. A battle for freedom of speech, for freedom of religion, for the equality of the sexes, and the right of people, including gays, to live their lives as they see fit. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, a country cannot remain half slave and half free. Permit tyranny in your midst, and you'll end up tyrannized yourself. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in London and Madrid, in the wake of the Van Gogh murder, and the cartoon riots, and the months of nightly disturbances, complete with cries of Allahu Akbar in the French suburbs, it is clear that the West freedom now comes with an asterisk. In Western Europe, it is clear that the West freedom now comes with an asterisk. In Western Europe, many leaders have already chosen a gradual and amiable accommodation with extreme illiberality over an unpleasantly confrontational defense of liberty. Apparently, in the view of all too many of these leaders, the only hope for peaceful coexistence with the Muslims in their midst lies in an ever more vigorously exhorted and enforced deference to and accommodation of Islam. Increasingly, non-Muslim women are enjoined to respect an ideology that views them as whores, who are in profound need of merciless discipline. Gays are enjoined to respect an ideology that would condemn them to death. Free people are enjoined to respect an ideology that in larger and smaller ways is already stripping them of their freedom. When I first moved to Europe, the challenge to freedom was still relatively invisible. As I've said, you had to veer away from the tourist centers to even begin to get the real picture. No more. On a couple of nights last January, only 10 minutes walk from my front door, there were violent riots on the main street of Oslo, a street that is generally quiet and orderly, if not downright dull. But on those January nights, Oslo looked like Gaza at its worst. In fact, the rioters' motive was supposedly rage over events in Gaza. In reality, the riots were nothing more than a brutal show of force by young men who probably could not find Gaza on a map, but who were plainly determined to bend Norway to their will. As such, it was no isolated incident, but yet another step in a relentless process that I began witnessing 11 years ago in Amsterdam. And of course, this isn't just a European phenomenon. Events like the prosecution of Ezra Levant and Mark Stein made it clear to me that the one major mistake I made in my book, While Europe Slept, was in underestimating the vulnerability of North America to the same forces I saw bringing down freedom in Western Europe. 9/11. 7/7 in London, 4/11 in Madrid. After each of these and other atrocities, European officials and journalists wasted no time reminding everyone that only a tiny minority of Western Muslims are terrorists. And of course that's true. But it's not the point. Jihadist terrorism is only a distraction from the subtler forms of jihad going on around us. Indeed, terrorism, as many jihadists have realized, is counterproductive, because it only underscores the fact that there is indeed a jihad underway, and it draws media attention and it causes a public reaction. But what the media can, and to an extraordinary extent does avoid covering, and what the public can therefore fail to fully notice and comprehend, are the subtler, less spectacular, everyday aspects of jihad and of the capitulation thereto. And these developments are far more dangerous than terrorism. For terrorism cannot destroy the freedom of the West. What can destroy it is a gradual, broad-based, officially unacknowledged, and almost imperceptible day-by-day adjustment to Islam and to Sharia law, an adjustment that, if allowed to continue, will indeed ultimately lead to the end of freedom as we know it. This is the silent jihad and the silent surrender, and we're living right in the midst of it. And the unfortunate reality is that we can't sit back and relax in the assurance that our mainstream media will keep us fully informed about the ongoing threats to our freedom, and that our governments will protect us from those threats. They won't. If we cherish our freedom, we have to keep our eyes open and our ears open, and not be afraid to speak about what we see and hear, honestly, openly, and boldly. Thank you.